Hello, welcome again to the Origins of Poetry. This is the second class in that series. In the earlier class, we discussed the origins of poetry, and we even came face to face with, through her literary work, of course, the first known author to the human world, the first known author in human history. And we discussed the oral origins of poetry in Africa, in Egyptian cultures, in Sumerian cultures, in Mesopotamian region, and all that. In this class, we are going to discuss origins of poetry, especially in the context of Chinese literature and Indian literature. They too have a rich tradition of literature. But before that, before we go and discuss Indian origin of literature and Chinese origin of literature, we have an extraordinary epic. In fact, all of us know epics, right? We know what our epics are, we know what major Greek epics are. So if there is one epic that that acts as a kind of a prototype for all the epics, that epic is going to be the Epic of Gilgamesh. Again, this Epic of Gilgamesh is a product of Sumerian culture. Please remember Mesopotamian culture or the Sumers. Sumers are very well known for their artistic innovations, their use of language, and even their writing system. In fact, one of the earliest known writing systems we have is cuneiform, and that's again a product of Sumerian culture, Mesopotamian civilization. So Epic of Gilgamesh is also a cultural product of that region, and this too has an history of over 3,500 years. So the picture that you see is a stone tablet. It's called the Deluge tablet of the tale of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh epic in Akkadian. So it's a photograph of that stone tablet. So among all the national epics that we have, among all the epics of all cultures that we know, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the most ancient of them all. It deals with a popular and an able king of Uruk, of that region of Sumers. He was called Gilgamesh. So it's an epic that deals with the eponymous hero Gilgamesh and his friendship with Enkidu, and their separation. Enkidu dies, and that death leaves Gilgamesh very devastated. Unable to bear the loss of his close friend, he embarks on a journey in search of that secret, that was only privy to gods, the secret of eternal life. Whether he succeeds in that or not is the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides you with a riveting clash between the titans called Gilgamesh and Enkidu. They are titans because they have the capacity to defeat gods. So gods have every reason to be scared of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Therefore, they find a way to separate both of them. In fact, even how Gilgamesh and Enkidu also came to be friends is another interesting story. Unable to withstand the popularity of Gilgamesh, gods send Enkidu to destroy Gilgamesh, but being a powerful king that he is, Gilgamesh takes on Enkidu and defeats him. Nevertheless, a kind of friendship blooms between them, and that lasts for a lifetime. Now Gilgamesh alone was, was invincible. Now added to him you have Enkidu, and the duo, two of them together is a kind of a deadly force. Therefore now gods are fearing, so they want to now overthrow both of them. So in their plot, goddess Ishtar, in fact the tale tells that she was in fact rebuffed by Gilgamesh. She was spurned by Gilgamesh, and unable to bear that insult, she sends the sacred bull, a very mighty, powerful divine bull, to fight Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh almost single-handedly defeats, and almost he tears down the bull to two different pieces. So this is a kind of an extraordinary epic that you have all the features of great epics that you find here. So the tale itself begins with 5 different Sumerian poems that talk about Gilgamesh. Of course, that was a Sumerian name, now we call it Gilgamesh. So the entire thing seemed to have happened during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, somewhere between 2100 and 1800 BC. So approximately, let's say 3200, 3300 years ago. Okay. The Epic of Gilgamesh as we now have it, was compiled sometime during the 18th century BCE. Until then, it was scattered across 12 different stone tablets, and during the 18th century BC, they were almost clubbed together, and they were called the Old Babylonian Tablet. So, as I said earlier, the entire epic is written in cuneiform, which is a remarkable and a highly scientific Mesopotamian writing system, and of course this is one of the earliest written forms that we have. So as I said, gods conspire to break up the friendship between Enkidu and Gilgamesh. So they somehow succeed in killing Enkidu, and unable to bear the loss of his friend, he embarks on a kind of an epic journey in search of a secret that grants him an eternal life. Unfortunately, of course, eternal life is something that's been denied to the mortals. We know that truth. So he learns this bitter lesson towards the end of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He learns this lesson: life which you look for, you will never find. For when the gods created man, they let death be his share, and life withheld in their own hands. So death was sent as a kind of companion to life. Anything that's born must die. Therefore, no point hankering after the dead friend. We must learn to move on, make amends with the losses and move on. That's a kind of an epic lesson that Gilgamesh learns, and that is a kind of an epic lesson that entire humanity can learn and benefit from. This is the story of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest epic of all the epics that we have. This is the oldest epic. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, we can go to the tale of a shipwrecked sailor. Today, the Epic of Gilgamesh is considered one of the oldest, epics, but technically speaking, the tale of shipwrecked sailor, though it is not as popular as the Epic of Gilgamesh, this predates the Epic of Gilgamesh at least by a couple of 100 years, at least by 500 years. So if the Epic of Gilgamesh was composed, during 2100 BC, so this must have been written around 2500 BC. Okay. And the story of how we chanced upon it is also very interesting. During the 19th century, somebody came across a piece of papyrus on which this story was written, and today that piece of papyrus is stored in the Imperial Museum in St. Petersburg. So that's how we have come to receive this tale of shipwrecked sailor. And unlike other epics, let's say for instance the tale of Sunandaita that we discussed in the previous class, or the tale of Gilgamesh, they are based on historical personalities. They were based on their protagonists were, they resembled, at least resembled, if not exactly an historical pictures. These tales depicted personalities who existed in history in some form or the other. But the tale of shipwrecked sailor in that sense is not historical. It does not belong to an historical narrative genre. It belongs to a speculative fiction poetry. It's a narrative poetry on a fictitious sailor, a fictitious ancient Egyptian sailor who takes a voyage to the king's mines. And here this is very interesting because the tale of shipwrecked sailor makes use of many interesting and riveting narrative strategies. According to modern narrative theories, we have frame narratives, box narratives, and many other narrative strategies through which a plot unfolds. Story is taken from stage to stage. So this particular piece, again written more than 4,500 years ago, makes use of all these narrative strategies. The tale begins with a sailor who has returned from his voyage in the sea, and unfortunately his voyage in the sea is not a very fruitful venture. It's a kind of a failed venture. It's a failed expedition. And this expedition was undertaken by the sailor at the behest of the king. Now that he has come back rather not very successfully, the sailor is very anxious to meet the king. He is very apprehensive as how his king, who has sponsored the entire expedition, would receive him. So this is when one of his attendants or maybe friends consoles him, saying him not to worry, and he advises the sailor to downplay his misfortune, and almost reassures him with the proverb, the mouth of a man saves him. If you know how to convey even your misfortune, even your failed expedition, the king would forgive you. It all depends on how you present it. That's how he advises. And then in order to alleviate his fear and to encourage his master or friend, this attendant narrates a story of his own previous voyage, and how his voyage was beset with many dangers, disasters, and how in the process he met God, a king, and even a serpent, and how he rescued himself from all those traps and came back, and things like that. So this is how the narration of the attendant begins within the frame of the narration of a sailor who has just begun narrating the story. That's why we can call it a kind of a frame narrative. You can even go ahead and call it a box narrative also, because then this attendant whose narrative forms a part of the narrative again is a part of another narrative that the serpent who he comes across during his expedition narrates. So there is a kind of a tale within a tale within a tale. So what is a tale becomes a narrative point for another tale, and what is a narrative point becomes a tale for the other narrative point, something like this. So it makes use of some interesting narrative strategies, and it's now of course available in English translation. If the story interests you, you can as well take a look at it. So from here of course we go to the Chinese origin of literature, especially poetry, the land of the dragon. So here the early records of Chinese poetry can be found. The earliest records of Chinese poetry seem to have been written during 11th century BCE. So, something like again more than 3000 years ago, or let us say about 3000 years ago. So, the first known Chinese poetic book is called Shinjing, or you can call them the Book of Songs or Book of Odes or just songs, something like that, composed during the early part of the first millennium BC, of course, and this is the earliest collection of Chinese poems that we have. So, it is a collection that comprises about 305 works, scattered across 5 different books. And one of the, this Shijing is one of the 5 classics that's available to us today, and this classic is attributed to Confucius, one of the earliest and most influential Chinese philosopher. In fact, Han Dynasty a little later officially followed the doctrine of Confucius across their kingdom and adopted Confucianism as their way of life, or as their official religion, and they popularized all these works of Confucius. And interestingly, in China, of course, we find the existence of their poetry both in their written form and in their oral form. Okay. So, in the earlier cultures, in the earlier civilizations, if the origin of poetry is found in only oral forms, oral traditions, in China it is available as we have it now. They simultaneously existed, both in oral traditions and written traditions. As we have it now, probably we still may not have access to the purely oral poetry, but as we have it now, they existed simultaneously. Okay. Apart from these works, of course, the poems of China are preserved both in that form, written form, and they constitute the poetic tradition of China. Apart from these works, we also have other folk poems or ballads, and all these folk poems or ballads are sung, and they again constitute a part of a performative oral tradition that we know now. Apart from, of course, the works of Confucius, and most of these folk works are anonymous. We do not exactly know when and how or where, by whom they were composed, and there is a scope for a lot of interpolation. In fact, the interpolation again in textual editing, textual criticism, and of course text editing. Interpolation is a term that we use for later editions. Probably when the text may have been edited during the later time, there is a chance that someone else may add his or her own part to this, and that is how the text must have been expanded. So, most of the ancient folk Chinese poetry that we have is interpolated in that sense. Of course, all literature is interpolated, all oral literature, when it is passed on from mouth to mouth, generation to generation. Each generation will have added their own ethos, right? Each generation will have added its own ethos, its own sensibilities. So, all products of oral culture are interpolations to a large extent, okay, including our epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Another important early poetry collection is Shu Qi. It is again dated to 5th century and 3rd century BC. So, they are from the state of Chu, and they again constitute the part of classical Chinese poetry. So, China too has a rich tradition of poetry, both oral tradition of poetry and written tradition of poetry, and they again constitute an interesting study for scholars of poetry. And Chinese poetry too, like other earlier ancient poetry from across cultures, Chinese poetry too has had significant impact on world literature per se. So, from here we can go to the the ancient Greek poetry. Of course, Greece is sometimes called the cradle of European civilization. In fact, the European Enlightenment owes its debt to Greek civilization and Greek culture. So, the earliest Greek poetry, again in oral tradition, but later of course preserved in the written form, is traced back to the Iliad and the Odyssey written by Homer. Historians believe that they are the epics of Greece, they are Greek epic poetry, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Of course, when it comes to epics, though the Epic of Gilgamesh is the most ancient, when it comes to the popular epics that the world has seen and known, the Greek epics are the ones, in fact the most popular epics that the world has read probably, and they have their influence on other epics as well. So, they must have been composed during 800 BCE. The Iliad, which is an earlier work, refers to, it is also called the Song of Ilium. Okay. It is set during the Trojan War. You must have even watched this movie Troy, right? Of course, it is based on this epic. Iliad forms a kind of an epic template for epics of other generations and other cultures. Okay, so it deals with the Trojan War and also narrates, a kind of an epic quarrel between the king Agamemnon and Achilles. And the story also discusses the 10-year siege of the city of Troy. And it is a treasure house of lot many Greek legends. So, all of us will have heard of the story of Troy or the Trojan horse. At least we must have heard of Trojan horse, right? Troy was a kind of an, you couldn't penetrate into the city of Troy, impenetrable city. So, despite giving their best, the Greeks cannot enter into their city because the city is well protected by an extraordinary wall, and as long as they do not gain an entry into the city of Troy, they can't win this war. So, therefore, what do the Greeks do? They create a huge wooden horse, and leave behind, they pretend as if they have left the scene, and in fact they leave as well. But what has happened, again this Trojan horse is an epitome of Greek sculpture, Greek wood carving and all that. So, very cleverly Greeks, some of their soldiers have hidden themselves in this huge Trojan horse, and then when the people of Troy take it, assuming victory, they take this huge wooden horse to their city, and that is when of course they come out and open the gates and they give a signal. That is when the Greeks re-enter and then win this war. Okay, so the entire war lasts for about 10 years. The story deals with this in all its detail. And the Odyssey refers to a little later, of course, after the Iliad. The story of Odyssey deals with the return of Odysseus. He is one of the wisest Greek heroes and Greek kings. He is a king of Ithaca, one of the wisest guy, blessed by gods. He returns. All the major kings of they almost die in war. It is only Odysseus who succeeds in returning to Greece, and the travels and travails of Odysseus, and his 10-year journey back constitutes the tale of Odyssey, another interesting tale. So, these are extraordinary Greek, ancient Greek poetry. From here we go to other Greek poets and other Greek poetic forms. After the Homeric epics, we have the odes of Sappho, odes of Pindar, which are well known throughout the world now. Sappho is also considered as the 10th muse in the Greek tradition. She is considered as the 10th muse, lived between 630 and 570 BCE, and she is a very major Greek poet from the island of Lesbos. Her poetry is basically lyrical. She, along with Alcaeus and Pindar, they form a kind of an influential poetic circle during their times, and her poetry is also marked by revolutionary lyrics, and she is also well known for, she is considered even as a kind of an icon of love for her diverse and radical portrayal of the theme of love. So this painting, the painting of Sappho by a 19th century painter, English painter, Sir Lawrence, depicts Sappho along with her close friend watching poet Alcaeus reciting his poems or playing his lyre. So from ancient Greece, again we have Pindar and Pindaric odes. Today, ode is again a form of poetry, a subtype of poetry, and they have their origins to Pindar. So you have Pindar, a major poet, and who seem to have created a kind of a form. Therefore, they are called Pindaric forms, a major figure. This is something that we'll have to keep in mind. So from the Greek civilizations, we come to the lores of our own beloved land, ancient Indian literature. With a discussion of ancient Indian poetry, we would be closing our series of the origins of poetry. Of course, the list is not exhaustive, but I am sure, having discussed African origins of poetry, Mesopotamian origins of poetry, and Chinese origins of poetry, European, Greek origins of poetry, and Indian origins of poetry, we have covered representatively all major civilizations. Of course, many significant ones are left, but that's for maybe some other course. So coming to ancient Indian literature, again our ancient poetry was, it belonged to the oral tradition. So the earliest known work in Indian literature is called the Rig Veda. Of course, one of the 4 major Vedas, the Rig Veda. We have the Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and the Atharva Veda. So this is one of the earliest Vedas, So composed in Vedic Sanskrit, and it is credited to have had 1028 hymns. So again, the exact date of composition of the Vedas is unknown, but historians determine that they must have been composed somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE. So approximately, again, 3600 years ago. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are also our ancient epics. They are of again, let's say 1100 BCE and 10th century, 11th century or 10th century BCE, something like that. Again, the exact dates we do not know. These are just some intelligent guesses. They too are our national epics, written in Vedic Sanskrit, and they constitute, together with the Vedas, the Upanishads, and these epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they constitute the great Indian literary tradition and are considered and are held high even today. So having come to know about our origins of literature, Indian origins of literature, let's immerse ourselves, let's go a little deeper and immerse ourselves in a couple of, it's just to give us a taste of our ancient literature. The piece on my right, it's in Vedic Sanskrit. This shloka or a hymn is taken from the Rig Veda, and there is another significance to this. This mantra is called Mahamrutyunjaya mantra. Recently, this Mahamrutyunjaya mantra was in great circulation, especially after the pandemic hit us. So this mantra is considered as one of the most powerful mantras. This is of course dedicated to Lord Shiva, and the reason behind its circulation recently was that it's believed that if you chant this mantra a couple of times a day, it's going to cast a kind of a protective layer around us, grant us. See, poetry itself, in that sense, we have read this, right, almost, whether it is in Greece or in Africa or in Mesopotamian cultures. Poetry has its roots in prayers, songs, hymns and prayers. So any prayer comes with a certain belief. So here too people believe that if you recite this. So the purpose here is of course to give you a taste of how it sounds, Mahamrutyunjaya mantra. And later we have other excerpt from English translation. It's not, this English translation is not for this particular mantra, it's another mantra. Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanat Mrutyor Mukshiyamamrutat. So it means that it's a prayer to Lord Shiva. So we are praying Lord Shiva to cast a kind of a protective spell around us so that we are spared of untimely death. We are spared of untimely death. Roughly speaking, it could be a rough translation of it. Rig Veda, though, is highly religious, it is one of the most inquisitive Vedas, we can say. Look at, there is a scope for questioning our gods here. There is a scope for, quarreling with our gods here, not believing it, then reconciling with it, So let me read from Rig Veda in English translation. Who knows for certain, who shall here declare it? Where was it born? Where came creation? The gods are later than this world's formation. Who then can know the origins of the world? None knows where creation arose, and whether he has or has not made it. He who surveys it from the lofty skies, only he knows, or perhaps he knows not. Such an extraordinary agnostic philosophy embedded in the core of a religious hymn. Most of cosmogony works, religious works that deal with the origin of the universe, whether it is the old Bible or not, they attribute the creation of this universe to God, right? You must have heard these stories from the Bible where God having created the universe in 7 days and all that. Most of the other originary works also talk about it, but here is Rig Veda that says that this universe itself predates the arrival of God. Who knows for sure what this universe is, from where it came and where it will go? The gods are later than this world's formation. This universe came first. Gods are a later formation than that. And who made it? How it was made? All these things we do not know. He who surveys it from the lofty skies, probably he knows it, or he too may not know, because he too may have been a later formation in this universe. Look at the philosophy of agnostic philosophy embedded in the core of a religious text. So these things make Rig Veda an extraordinary literary piece and a great read. So with these things we can conclude. Of course, in this class we have discussed the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest epics. We discussed the tale of shipwrecked sailor. We also discussed origins of poetry in China, Greece and India. With these things, we can conclude our discussion on the origins of poetry. In the next class, probably we can come up with different types of poetry, elements of poetry, and continue our preoccupation with poetry and its extraordinary world of creativity and imagination. Thank you.